We all knew what was happening in the community, and I don't think anyone, we all knew people who had gone down on that plane. And terrible as that was, I don't think what any of us predicted was that how resolute Canada appeared to be in the years that followed to forget about this or to do its best to speak of it in very cloaked terms. I think to a large part, Canadian authorities were shocked and embarrassed when the plane blew up. There had been more than enough evidence pointing to disaster was imminent, including express warnings from India that Air India was a target, and in fact that flight was of concern. But also, what I feel is that at a political level, too many of our politicians were, I guess, more interested in keeping overall relations with certain groups within the Indian community harmonious. And as Patrick Ruther detailed, the one credible reason for handling this topic gently is you don't want to tar the entire community. A few madmen plotted to bring down an airline. That should not be visited upon everybody. But staying silent has only allowed that quarter to become more vocal. And it's just inconceivable that authorities turned a blind eye. There weren't very many of us. I mean, to put it plainly, not that many brown people around. So when you saw somebody who looked like you didn't care which part of India they came from. You didn't even care, if they were from India. Like any part of the subcontinent was fine. You were just so happy to see someone that you have a bit of a shared history with and some of a shared struggle. It was not easy being a visible minority in Vancouver in those days. But with tension growing in India, tension in the Punjab, actions by the Indian government of the day, particularly military assault on the complex of the Golden Temple, which is the holiest site in Sikhism, that contributed to a lot of enmity to India being expressed on the streets of Vancouver. And people who spoke up were intimidated, harassed, beaten. Ujjal Dosanjh is lucky to be alive. He was attacked by an assailant wielding an iron bar because he'd been trying to speak up as the voice of moderation, trying to both simultaneously, find some, I guess, peace within the community, asking people, not to go down this path of extremism, but also trying to alert the Canadian authorities that this is a problem you need to pay attention to. And it's something where that very marked change set in the early 80s, that now we were divided into camps. And that was disturbing. And then, of course, the ultimate of pain that the terrorist attack was plotted and conceived of by our own, Canadians taking down Canadians. Nearly half the Canadian victims were our youth, and it was by far the majority of occupants on the plane. And yet it surprises me the way Canadian officials, or Canadian politicians in particular, will try very hard not to acknowledge the Canadian dimensions of this tragedy. That comparison to 9/11 was misplaced. 9/11 was the attack of a foreign, entity on a sovereign state. It's easy to rail against that. It is much harder to talk about domestic terrorism. And in my mother's piece, I think she referred to it as more akin to the Oklahoma City bombing, which again, you didn't hear a whole lot of after that happened. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that within our own borders, we have people conspiring to murder Canadians en masse, or to murder, the residents of any country en masse. It's a difficult conversation. I do get it. But again, not having the conversation has two consequences. One, it's incredibly painful to the families of the survivors, the families of the victims. And the other thing is you run the risk of, could it happen again? I mean, part of the reason the plane came down is because all those warnings, all that security, to the extent that they had information, the belief was, it's not going to happen. And then it did. So again, I just find it astounding that we could be risking playing with fire all over again.
How do you see this tragedy back in 1985 impacting Canada today, in particular, potentially Indo-Canadians? Is this something that remains a contentious issue, an impactful tragedy? What do you see around you in 2023?
It certainly remains an issue. And, one of sadness that the bombing happened. It could have been prevented. And Canada chose to sort of write off the families, with as little fanfare as possible. But apart from that, it is worrisome that there is still dialogue within the community that is continuing to harbor resentment to India. That's about the most polite way I can think of putting it. Chances are more Canadians are aware of the persecution of Sikhs in India than they are of the punishment for that activity, which was meted out on Canadians. But there's a story that every year we will hear on June 4th. It's the anniversary of the Indian government's, storming of the Golden Temple, which even that is an incomplete story. What we don't hear is that retribution for that followed on June 23rd, 1985, targeting Canadians. And this, I feel, it is worrisome if Canadian authorities are continuing to turn a blind eye to it.